Okay, guys, so we're moving into Unit 9, which is also encompassing evolution, but now it's talking specifically about the generation of a new species and how that actually happens. Okay, so in order to actually have a new species, you have to have a microevolution. And so when we're talking about what actually happens when you have evolution, the smallest level at which that might happen is the population. Okay, so you can only have evolution occur at the actual population. Now, in terms of some key terms that you need to know, gene pool is one of those key terms. And basically, what a gene pool is all the alleles that are represented in the individuals within that population. Okay, so whether or not they have short hair or long hair or curly hair or whatever those alleles are. And so when we look at microevolution, really what it is it's the change in frequency. And so what frequency is the number of times something appears of those alleles within a gene pool. So, for example, down here on what we're looking at is basically the number of times you get a white flower or the number of times you get an orange flower, okay, or the allele frequencies. All right, so the number of times you get that dominant phenotype here is 70%, and the number of times you get that recessive phenotype here is 30%. And now this isn't just about the color, right, because the color is the phenotype, but the allele is the genetic information or the genotype. So these are the genotypic allele frequencies. Moving to generation 2, you can see that changes, right? So now you have more recessive phenotype, genotype appearing versus the dominant phenotype. And then here you have basically in that generation 3, 100% of the dominant allele genotype. And so that's all represented by those capital R's, which are represented by the orange flowers. Okay, so really what we're looking at here is the number of times that particular allele or gene appears within that particular population. And so the way we get there is via two modalities, and that's natural selection or genetic drift. And so we're going to go over both of those now. Okay, so genetic drift. So really what happens here is there's just a change in the gene pool, and that's just due to chance. There is no real selecting force. And so in this case, if we look at the bottleneck effect, that's when a disaster is basically reducing the population size. And because it's reduced the population size, it has reduced the gene pool allelic frequencies. All right, and so if we look here, here's the original population here on the left, and then you can see there's some bottlenecking event that happened, i.e., a tornado, a hurricane, an earthquake, and there is some surviving population. Notice, in this surviving population, what have we eliminated? Well, I can tell you for one, if you're just looking at color of these little marbles, we've eliminated all of the orange marbles. And there was no food force, there was really no environmental force. Really, the force here was simply by chance, and it was just massive disaster that killed all the orange balls, right? And so here is just another example on the right-hand side, looking at a person stepping on some bugs. Just so happens that the person always steps on the green bugs because they can see the green bugs better, and therefore what you end up having in the surviving population is less green bugs and more of the tan bugs. There is no rhyme or reason for someone really for a hurricane or a natural disaster to happen. Okay, founder effect is another example of how the genetics can drift, and that's basically when you have a few individuals colonizing a new habitat, and so basically the allele frequency changes here based on who the founding population members are. And so if you look at founding population A versus founding population B, they both came from that same pool, but they've separated themselves out based upon how they migrated or whatever. And now you can see that founding population A really has these gray beetles and these yellow kind of beetles, and the descendants then of them are going to be gray and yellow. And so that is what's going to populate whatever their new area is. And the founding population here is on the bottom, these red guys and these yellow guys. And so what you get there is descendants that are mostly red and yellow. Okay, there can also be selectional forces based on food, environment. Okay, and so the first thing I want to introduce to you guys is called directional selection. All right, and what that basically means is that there is one thing that is really changed. And so in this case, food has become scarce. Okay, so I didn't just make that up, that actually says it on there. And you can see here on the left-hand side, we're looking at this graph. There are the y-axis is number of birds in a population, and on the x-axis you see beak size. So basically, the smaller the beak, the more left you are. The larger the beak, the more right you are. Kind of the medium beak size is right in the middle. Okay. Notice this is also color-coded. So we can have low mortality and high fitness, and that's represented by the yellow. All right, so less of these guys on this side are dying, and high fitness means that they're just more fit for whatever that environmental pressure or environment is at that moment. And on the left-hand side, you have high mortality, low fitness. And so what does this mean? Well, if we look at it, basically it's telling us that the smaller your beak, the less likely you are to live. The larger your beak, the more likely you are to live. Okay? And so what happens if there's some sort of selection saying basically food becomes scarce? Well, what happened in this case was the original peak, which was here, has shifted to the right. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, if we were to look at the average beak size between before and after, so this is before and then this is after, that average beak size has shifted to becoming larger. Okay, so this means you have actually forced the whatever the particular phenotype or allele that you're looking at, you've actually forced it in one direction. So we've actually shifted this way to have larger beak sizes in directional selection. So you're choosing, essentially, there's a direction that is being chosen by the external forces. Stabilizing selection, the best example of that is really birth weight. All right, so basically what that means is, like, you like to be nice, like, in the middle. In the middle is the safest place to be. All right, and so notice here's your yellow right in the middle. And so low mortality, high fitness, yay, that's good, right? And so what does that mean? So if we look at birth weight, low birth weight is no good. High birth weight, no good. Now what is it no good for? It's no good in terms of the percentage of the population that's being born and then would ultimately survive. And so you have a much greater chance of surviving if you're born kind of right in this is like the 7 to 8.5 pound range. All right. If you're above that, above 8.5 pounds or less than 7 pounds, your likelihood of surviving decreases. Okay, because we like to be right in the middle. So that's stabilizing selection, because basically the forces are forcing there to be one area of that peak that is being selected against. Okay, so please notice how we went from that lower peak, and then that peak basically became more exaggerated in the middle, or the average there. Okay, so disruptive selection, usually this is the one I tell you guys to remember. This is the one that's most identifiable, in my mind at least, because basically you go from that single peak to two peaks. And the reason for that is basically that the population has split into two subgroups. And each of those subgroups have different specialties. And so, for example, you get some birds that have smaller beak sizes, and some birds that have larger beak sizes, and less birds that are essentially not specialized. And this is how species tend to develop, because basically what you end up having is you end up having two populations which have two different likes or wants, and they don't cross over with one another, right? These, ultimately what will happen is these beaks will get so small that they are completely unable to process the food that this particular population would like. And so now let's look at the process of speciation, or the development of a new species. So how do new species actually arrive? Well, for one, you can have what's called reproductive isolation. And so here's an example of that here on the right-hand side. So the y-axis represents mating activity, and the x-axis here is representing time in months. All right, and so here we have March 1st, May 1st, April 1st. Notice that the wood frog's mating activity peaks kind of in, let's call it the end of March, and the leopard frog's mating activity peaks at the end of April. And so if they're not active at the same time for mating, then they will not reproduce with each other, because they will not be at the same point reproductively. And so this is generally how you start seeing the appearance of those new species. What will end up ultimately happening is that you get two independent gene pools, and these guys will both respond to natural selection and genetic drift as basically separate units, because they're reproducing at different times. Therefore, their food and resources that they need are basically the want or desire for those things are going to change in terms of time, and of course they're not just going to be in the same place to reproduce at the same time. Okay, so reproductive isolation was one way. Reproductive isolation was one way of speciation. Another is behavioral isolation. So there are a bunch of different animals that have different courtship rituals or mating rituals. One of my favorites is the birds of paradise. And I don't post it here, but you can look up birds of paradise courtship rituals. They basically build these like exotic looking nests, and they clean all around their nests. And the ones that have the brightest, cleanest houses, essentially, males are doing this. They attract the best females, or the brightest, most attractive females. And so if there's another bird who's not interested in that courtship ritual, then they will not mate with them. And so there's other things that especially birds do. Birds, I mentioned birds because they have very interesting courtship rituals, and they're studied quite a bit for their courtship rituals. They can sing. They'll have different songs. So if a bird sounds the best, they're the one that gets the best mate. There's also, I think they're called rockfish. And those guys are basically known for collecting rocks at the bottom of the ocean in coral reefs. And the ones with the biggest piles attract the best females. So, again, there might be another species who's doesn't do this, and so they're not going to be interested in that. So that's a behavioral isolating mechanism. Second here, or actually third, when you think about reproductive isolation being the first, is geographic isolation. And basically, these are guys that are basically separated by a geographic barrier. So, looking at rivers or lakes, and specifically animals that don't travel long distances. All right, maybe there's different types of trees on one side versus the other, and so that would cause different animals to develop different fur color or different foliage, as an example. And so in this case, we're looking at these kaibab squirrels and the Abert squirrels. And so you can see the range of the Abert squirrel being basically everything right of the Colorado River, and more specifically, the Grand Canyon right here. So the range of the Kaibab squirrel is basically on the other side of the Grand Canyon. These guys aren't on the right side of the Grand Canyon because they can't get there. These Kaibab squirrels, they developed different fur color based on their ability to fully blend in or camouflage themselves with the different trees that are located on the west side of the Grand Canyon. Then there's also temporal isolation, and that basically just means time. Temporal is time. And so, do they reproduce at different times? This takes place in a lot of plants, right? So certain plants are out right now. So for example, right now we have lots of weeds, but we don't necessarily have flowers that are coming out, right? Or we have tulips right now, but we don't have fancy tropical plants. The reason why we don't have any tropical plants right now is because tropical plants don't like to be here. So there's definitely an environmental factor there. But even if you were to bring a tropical plant into our environment, it wouldn't actually be ready to reproduce until the summer, because that's when it would be comfortable. And that's about time. That's about timing in terms of the seasons. But there's also then just things that like to, say, reproduce at night versus reproducing during the day. Are you nocturnal, or do you like to be active during the day? Are you diurnal? So really it depends. Are you in the same time, same place? Do your rituals and normal kind of everyday being and activity link up with other animals? If they don't, you don't ever have the opportunity to commingle, and therefore you don't have the opportunity to generate any offspring. And that's what I have for Unit 9.